Hey, hello. I just want to make sure you can hear me, first of all. Good to go? Okay. So we are today debating on the topic people who do not vote during the presidential election should pay a fine. I am here to say people who do not vote during the presidential election should pay a fine because overall, I believe it ensures a more representative democracy without inhibiting any rights to the democratic exchange between rights and duties. So to defend this, some house cleaning and definitions. I've interpreted the debate title to apply to United States elections. Since the U.S. does not currently impose fines or any similar sanctions, I believe most of my arguments would still work when applied to other countries. I've interpreted the proposition to refer to both a policy argument, which is that a law should be in place to mandate voting, as well as an ethical argument that people owe their voice to the democratic system, which protects them as part of society. And overall, I've also taken it to be generalized, accepting that there could be exceptions for whom a fine could not apply. I will not argue that all non-voters should pay a fine no matter what. There are exceptions, but rather than in most cases, a fine for not voting should apply. On the policy side, compulsory voting increases voter turnout and therefore the democratic legitimacy of government. There are many examples worldwide of this happening historically and today that also go to show like the different levels at which this can mandate things will still increase voter turnout, and when it is not mandated or when the mandate is taken away, voter turnout decreases. To continue with the legitimacy of the policy side, voting, I want to make sure I'm good. To continue with the legitimacy of the policy side, voting fines are consistent with compulsory citizen participation in the judicial system and defense system. By that, I'm referring to jury duty and participating in the draft. We also have compulsory participation in the education system. Even homeschooling still counts as fitting that definition. So overall, what this means is that mandating voting would still be sound constitutionally, and this also assumes continuation from the current system. So believing that jury duty or the draft shouldn't be compulsory, it's a separate debate. So for this one to go forward, we're kind of moving with the standard already established in America. And finally, in the ethical side of things, it's just that the election of representatives is the responsibility of citizens with more weight than just a right. Mandating voter participation is a step toward a more free society, actually, because it contributes to a truly people-owned and people-controlled government. This is defended by Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because in order for citizens to have rights granted by the government, they also must have duties to that government in turn to protect the liberty of others. In this case, mandating voting by imposing a fine on non-voters is in line with regulating a democratic system to ensure a society is functioning. So with that, I've said a lot, so I'll go ahead and turn it over.
Okay, I have a lot of different points to bring up. I'm going to start out with some disadvantages before I go up to the top of the flow. I have four major disadvantages about any type of system that would fine people for not voting. Mandatory voting violates religious freedoms. The LA Times said, quote, by avoiding the ballot box, Jehovah's Witnesses are following religious groups that for reasons of theocracy, separatism, or persecution don't vote. The Amish, famous for separating themselves from society, do not vote. Black Muslim leader Elijah Muhammad in the mid-20th century urged his followers not to participate in the government of a predominantly white society. And I mentioned Amish here. Fines for not voting are an assault on the right of millions of adherents to these groups to freely practice as they choose. 2, mandatory voting harms freedom of speech because freedom of speech also means the freedom not to speak. According to International Free Speech Organization Article 19, this principle was won the support of domestic courts. In Woolley versus Maynard, for example, the court said that New Hampshire's requirement that cars bear a license plate that said live free or die was unconstitutional because people in New Hampshire had the right not to bear the government's message and not to speak, an inherent right not to speak. Additionally, many countries such as Italy have rescinded compulsory voting, and there are few developed countries that support the policy. The former Italian foreign minister Antonio Martino said, quote, there was finally a consensus that it was a basic infringement of freedom, end quote. 3, mandatory voting erodes respect for the political system. When people are forced to vote against their will, they get creative revenge, which harms the political process more than their lack of participation did in the first place. Time magazine, is talking about Brazil, which has mandatory voting. When the voters of a large industrial city went to the polls to elect new municipal officers, they showed their disgust by electing a goat named Fragrant to the city council. In Sao Paulo, Brazil's biggest city, the top vote getter was a rhinoceros named Rubbish. 4, mandatory voting disproportionately harms the poor. Look at any of the many good arguments about voter ID laws. They could all be used against compulsory voting. Compulsory voting fines will always be hardest for the poor to pay, which is doubly unfair in light of the fact that the poor have more logistical difficulty voting. Many cannot take off from work, and they also rely on unreliable public transportation. Now I'm going to talk about solvency. Mandatory voting does not solve the problem of lack of participation. In Brazil again, CNN, quote, one candidate dressed as Wonder Woman to woo voters. Another created his own superhero, a laser beam shooting anti-communist. Another pointed to a serious problem, saying, quote, that voters think everyone is corrupt, so they vote for some guy who's just funny. And another one said, quote, elections are just a joke. So you can still not participate. And then when I come back, I'm going to talk about one more inherency point.
Okay, sounds good. For now, I'll try to go out. Was brought up. The religious freedom argument is a really quickly brought up thing from lots of people opposing it. And since I'm referring to within the American system, I think it is a very quick rebuttal to just say that there can, of course, be a religious freedom exception in place, just like there is one for serving in the military, just like there is one for giving jury duty. Since those were the examples I gave of already compulsory systems we have in the American democratic system, the same should be afforded for the right, or for the compulsion to vote. So certainly the exemption should still be in place for religious freedom, so that would not be a problem in the argument we are having. Regarding the freedom of speech argument, most, especially developed countries that have compulsory voting, have none of the above option. You would also often be able to just turn in a blank ballot. And that is indeed in this case what I'm arguing for, just that people go and turn in a ballot at all, whether they turn in a blank one or whether we have the system be updated to always have a none of the above option. The freedom of speech is still respected, because then you're able to really not voice your opinion if you truly do want to. You just have to turn in a ballot. And that's kind of a separate argument if you don't think that you should even have to do that. But at the very least, your preference to not contribute to the election system, if you truly don't want to, would not be inhibited upon. Erodes respect of the ballot. You brought up Brazil and their disrespect of the ballot there when they compelled voting. But Brazil, I don't believe, is a very accurate representation of what the United States of America is like. What I do believe is a more accurate representation of how the United States works is Australia, and they have compulsory voting as inflicted in 1924, and they are a more reflection of American society. And actually, they found that since compelling voting, they did not see any increases in randomized voting and intentionally spoiling the ballot whatsoever. They saw rates at which people intentionally spoiled the ballot remained at about 2 to 3%, even to this day, and ever since 1924, that has remained the case. And since they're more reflective of American society, we could expect kind of the same thing to happen in America if we were to try to put the system. And then the argument that it would be disproportionate against the poor. So in the past, then the Swiss cantons mandated voting. The highest penalty of any Swiss canton for not voting in elections was a fine of less than $7, and most being around $1. And that said, even after those fines were abolished, when those fines were so low, the voter turnout dropped 6 to 10%. And studies show that there was a 90% correlation to the abolished fines being in place, being responsible for that. So that does go to show that you can have really low fines that would not disproportionately affect the poor, that would still be understanding the poor's thing. And just as we mentioned before, with religious exemptions in place, you could still have just general exemptions for economic inequalities being in place. It can be handled like a tax bracket system, where you can still appeal if you do not have the means to vote and don't have the means to pay the fine. But at the end of the day, it wouldn't be an undue burden on poor people.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in and talk about how the affirmative team seems to be dodging the burden of their own resolution now, talking about, well, the fine could be $1, there can be exceptions for this and exceptions for that. You should, as the affirmative, either support fines or not support fines, but we'll jump into some inherency arguments that would deal with either way. However, I do not think this line of argumentation is entirely fair. However, to jump back into some inherency issues, non-voting does not mean non-participation. This is on that argument where society participation. I think participation is generally a good thing. I don't think you should have to participate if you don't want to participate, but you can participate without voting. A 1986 American Political Science Review conducted a study of immigrants from the Soviet Union and concluded that non-voting there correlated with high interest in politics, a critical political outlook, and dissident modes of behavior. Thus, voter abstention and non-competitive balloting can be hypothesized to constitute a significant political act rather than passivity. Additionally, according to the Heritage Foundation, or Census Bureau, surveys of non-voters show that the vast majority of them choose not to vote because they don't like the candidates or the campaign issues. Their choice not to vote sends its own message to candidates and political parties about their relevance or irrelevance to the lives of those non-voters. The affirmative said, well, we're going to have an optional, again, dodging the requirement of the resolution. She says we can have a none of the above option. But then again, what is the point of implementing this then when we already have a powerful and easy option? And sure, $1 fine might not be a large fine, but it's still government fining people for exercising their speech. Low participation in our elections is actually not caused is caused in large part by distrust for electoral integrity. According to Pippa Norris, the McGuire Lecturer in the John F. Kennedy School of Government, a Gallup poll 2 weeks before Election Day found that only 1/3 of Americans were very confident their vote would be counted accurately. And she also said that this performance is part of the reason America has low turnout. We should be focused on issues like integrity and issues like making candidates relevant to the voters again, and not trying to absolutely limit their speech, because non-participation in this system is itself speech and a critique of the system. Non-participation of the system is a statement about the system, and we also shouldn't dodge the resolution.
Okay, so I think that what I'm actually arguing is just reasonability with the argument. I still am for the overall proposition that people should have to pay the fine for not voting during presidential elections or during regular elections. I just recognize that there would be obvious exemptions in actually trying to make this happen in a realistic system. But ideally, assuming no religious exemption, assuming no inability to pay the fine whatsoever, this should still be the case. People should still actually be okay with wanting to pay the fine, or with having to pay the fine, because the overall point is that we owe our voice to the democratic system. Thing that I brought up in my opening statement was related to the United Nations Article 29, which acknowledges that after the entire United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is just a list of human rights, and then Article 29 goes to say none of these things are completely infallible, that there can be duties in place that you as a citizen are responsible for to make democracy work, to make the rest of those rights still intact for everyone else, including you. This is one of those things where everyone should have to vote and participate in the democratic system, because that's the way it keeps working as a whole for everyone. It's a more legitimately democratic society. Political scientists and analysts view it that way as well, where they actually rate legitimate democratic governments based off of their turnout rates. And by compelling voters to turn out, then you at least have that much more of a legitimate democratic government. And all these exemptions I've mentioned were just more safety nets to make sure they would actually work in a realistic system. But at the ultimate, ideal is still there, where people should still want to do that, because it is something that we owe the society we are within. I also would like to bring up that government then has that right, and that the overall, what is the point if there is a none of the above option, is still making you be involved in your political system, is still making you actually go out and put your vote on a ballot. There are obviously many other impediments to voting that need to be attacked, but down the road, this should be the ideal for the election system, where we have a system in which everyone contributes to it and feels as if it is actually they are not contributing. It is just the same, in my opinion, as how we all accept that you can, that you will be fined for running a red light or for speeding. And there are instances in which some things are more severe than others. You can run a red light in the middle of the night when no one is around and you're the only one in your car. You can only speed maybe 3 miles an hour over the limit. But if a cop is around in either one of those situations, you can still get pulled over and given a fine for doing so, just as much as you can get pulled over for speeding 20 or 30 miles over the speed limit. We as a society have accepted those kind of fines in either extreme of situations because it keeps the overall system safety for everyone's well-being. The same, it should be true for voting and keeping democracy working. Democracy only works if we're all involved, and to make us all involved, we all have to accept them, and then this is our duty, or else we are the ones paying the price for it, quite literally.
The affirmative team is not really addressing the burden for why make this change. Why is it so compelling that we make this large change? She says that democracy is best when we all participate. But what makes democracy best to begin with? What makes participation best to begin with? Why not freedom of expression? She said there is an ethical component to this debate, and I agree. Why not allow perfect freedom of expression like we currently have? And what are the harms that make this so important to change? I haven't really seen them demonstrated, at least not yet. Also, there was, she said, some democracies by voter turnout. Why? Why should that be our standard? I've read multiple evidence from a woman who works at Harvard, from the Heritage Foundation, from the Census Bureau, that talk about how turnout is not really a statement about political involvement or even about the democracy. It's they're Saddam Hussein technically had 100% turnout, according to him. Turnout is not everything at the end of the day. And finally, she said that the government has a right to make us contribute. Why? Why does government have a right to compel us to do something we don't have to do? And the Supreme Court has already decided in Woolley versus Maynard, like I said, that we don't. We have an absolute right as Americans. She said the resolution, I'm fine with talking about America. That's great. I love talking about America because I'm an American and it's what I know. I don't like talking about things I don't know about. Woolley versus Maynard said we have a right to not say things. And it was a very small burden in that case, a very small burden. Jehovah's Witnesses didn't want a license plate that said, live free or die. And the court there said that as Americans, we do have a right not to speak. And it's a right that many all over the world want to come here and experience because they don't have it at home. And in Brazil, you have to go vote for a rhinoceros or a goat to get your point across that you don't want to participate in this speech, as the study of people in the Soviet Union found. There, again, is no compelling reason for the affirmatives case, and I am eagerly awaiting to hear one.
Okay, you want reasons? You got them. For instance, how about the fact that when we have voting being compelled by a mandatory fine system, you have less concern with campaigns, political campaigns, trying to buy the vote all the time. You'd have a more independently owned democracy where people are already aware that they are the ones at stake and they have to go out and be involved anyway. So there would be less money and time spent from candidates and from their entire campaign teams working on getting certain people to just go to the polls in the first place. They would have to actually win over people as to why they should be voting for them when they go to the polls, rather than checking that none of the above option. We are the government at the end of the day, and that is why government has that right. At least that's how it should be. And the more people that vote, the more we are the government. That is at least the end of the day the point. That is the more free option, is when we own and have every stake in our government and we are the most involved in it. And that happens not just from having an opinion, not just from being involved in all those other different ways. None of those things really have a actualization of themselves unless you go out and make that said on a ballot. And with that said, checking none of the above is, I think, still more firm than not showing up at all. Because if you actually go out of your way to go to the ballot and there's all the options there and you still say none of the above, then you are actively saying, I truly don't support any of these people, then we need to do better. And there is then something to address there. The people recognize, wow, okay, 10% of the voters chose this guy, 5% chose this guy, but 85% chose none of them at all. And that it recognizes that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, that people are going to hold those people to more scrutiny because they all remembered, I went to that ballot and I didn't vote for either of these people. So I'm not gonna like any of them, and we're gonna make sure that they do everything we want as a people following up. It makes you more involved in your democracy because of that, because you went there on paper and filled that in. It overall actually still allows that freedom of expression by having that as well. And I think the fact that you just quoted Saddam Hussein as like a justification for why not allowing freedom of expression is kind of almost scary. We should not be trying to look at people like that to explain things. We also shouldn't be looking at Brazil and even Russia as examples of why this may or may not work. We should be looking at countries that are already more reflective of American society, as already mentioned, like Australia, but even Austria has done it and many other places. So there are many examples of it working, of it increasing voter turnout, of it not creating randomness in the ballots that were turned in. And the overall argument of, well, why is democracy even the best? Is because it's the most people-owned government, in my opinion. And this isn't really a debate on why democracy is the best, so I don't want to get too much into that. But that is the pillar that I think it kind of stands on, that because if we're in a society, I don't want anyone else to be able to tell me what I should be doing. And I think we all kind of agree that's why America has chosen to have at least somewhat of a democracy in place. And so to make it work, we all need to be involved in it.
The affirmative has said that democracy is the best because it's people-owned government. I would like to propose as a counter value to that, people-owned people. I believe that people should be able to do what they want to do if they're not express. We're not even talking about doing. We're not even talking about actions. We're talking about speech. People should be able to speak or not speak, participate or not participate in civic duties as they want to, as long as they're not, hurting other people. The affirmative team has not cited much evidence at all in their justifications. In fact, in this last speech, the affirmative began by saying less concern. There would be less concern with buying votes. That was one of her major arguments for why this could potentially be justified. But she said winning more votes will make them want to go after the people with legitimate issues. Again, no evidence provided as justification, but does it even make sense that if all of a sudden, instead of targeting 60 million people, they have to target 120 million people, that the campaigns are going to spend less money? That doesn't even math in my head. They're going to spend more money. They're going to focus on urban areas. They're going to pour the coffers into, winning people over. They don't win them over with issues. In America, we win people over with money, whether or not we have compulsory voting. That is how it's going to work. It's going to make population centers much more important than rural areas. You're not going to have the Idaho stump. And then she went on about how the state is us. We should be the state, and therefore participation can be required. But what about people who don't believe in a state? What about people who don't believe who believe the elections are rigged? What about people who don't believe in a capitalist state? What about, I have some friends who don't believe they should ever participate in a state that isn't explicitly Christian. There's a million different reasons why someone might not want to participate in at all, but it's not because of apathy. And it's not something we should punish. And again, she didn't address the fact that the Supreme Court said in Woolley versus Maynard, we have a right as Americans, and we're talking about America, we both agreed to that, a right as Americans not to speak. It is participation. It is thought out for a lot of these people, and we shouldn't punish it, even if it's just a symbolic punishment. It doesn't make any sense to do that. And as I quoted earlier, she brought up countries. Italy, a European country, and their foreign minister said that eventually they repealed their compulsory voting because, quote, it was an assault on freedom.
Okay. You said, what about people-powered people rather than government-powered people? But government is still the people. It is still people-powered government, as in people-powered people. You then use that to kind of go into this argument of, well, what if you just don't think that this state is how reflects you in the first place? If we're going to go down that path, then America isn't for you in the first place. Because like you said, what if people wanted a Christian-only state? Well, that's not what we are. We have freedom of religion. That's part of that First Amendment that we're trying to use, and that you were trying to use to defend not compelling voting. So those things aren't going to happen. And if you are one of these people who thinks that the overall system of democracy is not for you, then the state of America is not for you. That aside, if you accept that you want to be in America, and then you therefore accept that you're okay with democracy being how we run things, then you have to also accept that it is your duty to help make it run things as well. That is what I'm trying to get across, that you have this ethical responsibility to help make it work by giving your voice. And if you truly do feel like you have that you're part of your contribution to the civic duty is by not voting, you can go in that voting booth and you can put forward a blank ballot, and they can then count how many non-ballots were cast versus just an overall voter turnout rate versus non-voter turnout rate. They can count how many people intentionally went to the ballot and did not produce an actual opinion or preference of one person versus another, of one ballot measure versus another, because they do not support the system as a whole. And these things in place give the person, the voter, more power to then get what they want on the ballot, to then be more involved and have their voice really heard, to then use the stats of look at how many people didn't vote for this at all, because this is how not on par our government elections are with what we're asking for the people. That's what drives that force of change. That's what makes democracy work as well. And then you also mentioned, well, why would that affect how much money is spent? Less money would be spent on getting out the vote. Obviously, in exchange, that would mean more money would be spent on actually getting people focused on the right issues and selling the right issues to people. And I think that's an okay thing. That's a democracy at work. That's people power at work. That's everyone selling to each other, hey, I care about you and I want to make it work. In exchange, people can be more involved with their political officials, being more recognizing of what they do and do not support, because, oh, I went to that ballot and I checked none of the above and you're still doing this. And look, 80% of the people check none of the above and you're still trying to act on this measure. Why is this? We're going to make sure we have someone running against you next time. And since we all have to vote, we're going to vote for them next time. It overall gets people more easily involved in the whole system. And that is, since America is based off of this system, we owe it to each other to keep it going. Not participating does actually hurt other people. You said it doesn't, but it does. Choosing not to contribute your voice does. It does hurt other people because that's, again, how the system keeps going. Children don't really get to have a say. Felons don't yet get to have a say in all 50 states, as I believe they should. That's a separate argument. Even foreign nationals don't get to have a say. So voting, make sure that you're like doing your due diligence to keep everyone having a say as much as possible and to keep democracy going in the best interest of all people.
Briefly, in this last long speech, I'm going to kind of recap some of the points I brought up. Two pieces of evidence. Non-voting does not mean non-participation. Low participation that we currently have is caused largely by distrust or dislike of what's going on. States that have mandatory voting, people find other ways to express that actually degrade the quality of the government as a whole, because all of a sudden you have elected a goat. Mandatory voting does not solve that problem of lack of participation. Just mentioned that mandatory voting, if we went all the way with it, would violate religious freedoms. But as the affirmatives defined it, it does violate our freedom of speech. She never, ever addressed Woolley versus Maynard, which said we have an absolute right not to speak. And she said we should just leave America if we think that, the government isn't the people and we all have this civic duty to participate and it's all beautiful. But not everyone thinks the government equals the people, and they shouldn't be forced out of America for thinking that, because in America, that is their right and that is beautiful. That is American. Don't ever say an idea is not American. America is people being free to think and speak whatever they like. And this is absolutely an issue of speech. I don't think we've ever even disagreed on that. And that is just absolutely true. Mandatory voting is not helpful to that. It doesn't value that. I said I value the individual. My opponent very clearly has valued the collective. Again, never once addressed the two times I brought up the foreign minister of Italy, a European first world country, where their foreign minister said the reason we repealed compulsory voting is because it limited our freedom. He said over time, we came to see it as an imposition on freedom. And I'm actually going to pass the mic.
Fine, I'll quickly address the Italy argument. Just because the foreign minister said that doesn't mean he's right. Next item, I'll quickly address the Supreme Court argument. Just because they said that doesn't mean that's right. I do recognize that these instances happen, but I also recognize that compulsory voting does also happen in other modern developed countries, and it works just fine. And no one has said that. No foreign official has ever said, oh, this inhibits freedom. They've actually found that it just makes the democracy system more representative of the people. It empowers the person. And you keep mentioning the Brazil argument, but I did also already mention that Australia did not have that problem with randomized voting, with throwing the ballot away, with randomly electing goats. So none of those things really apply here.
As a policy, I believe I've won this round because there's been no inherent compelling reason, very little evidence given, and I think I gave like 10 cards just in my first speech. There's no compelling reason to do this, even if it's a fine of $1, even if you allow an option to do none of the above. Even if you allow a religious exemption, even if you just make the resolution as friendly and nice and flowery as possible, it still limits our absolute right to do as we will. And I just want to end with this really great quote from a Ray Bradbury book, Fahrenheit 451. Juan Ramon Jimenez said, "If they give you ruled paper, write the other way. Nothing's more American